Hello and welcome to EDGEcast, the series where we show you tips, tricks, and best practices when using Solid Edge. This episode will be all about assembly display configurations and how to use them effectively in your own assemblies. I'll start off by explaining what configurations are in the context of Solid Edge, particularly because old SolidWorks users might recognize the term, and it means something very different here. This will include creating your own configurations to save display states in an assembly. And next, I'll explain how Snapshot and Isolate commands can be used as short-term, faster alternatives to configurations. Then I'll show you what happens when you try to apply multiple configurations at once. Finally, I'll show you how to manage your created configurations and edit how Solid Edge behaves when they're applied. To start off, I'll answer the question, what are configurations? In simple terms, they are arrangements of shown and hidden parts in an assembly. In other words, the view state of the assembly and parts, to make it easier for users to view certain parts, part types, or to create convenient screenshots and draft views. These configurations are saved to an external .cfg file, not in the assembly itself. So if you ever wondered why assembly files are always created with a .cfg file of the same name next to them, that's why. Configurations are particularly convenient if you're using large assemblies with a mixture of components, especially if they're being worked on by multiple users. For example, a structural engineer might not care about seeing furniture in an assembly of a building while they work, and a drivetrain engineer might want to hide all other systems in a vehicle assembly. You can rapidly show the components that affect you, and then switch back to the overall assembly in just 2 clicks, providing you have the configurations already defined. One thing I should mention for all of you SolidWorks veterans out there is that configurations in Solid Edge don't mean the same thing as in SolidWorks. In Solid Edge, they do not allow different component positions. However, it is possible to create the same result, as SolidWorks configurations are more or less equivalent to alternate assemblies in Solid Edge, which do allow different component positions and alternate parts. The list of assembly display configurations, or to shorten the name, configs, can be found, as you might expect, in the assembly environment only, and they appear on the Home tab by default. If you apply a config from this list by ticking the checkbox next to its name, you show and hide certain parts. If you have zones, these also appear in the list, the contents of which can be shown in the same way, by checking the zones box. Checking multiple boxes will show all components shown in each one, and if components are shown in one config but hidden in another one, they'll still be shown. Without any further ado, let's take a look at an assembly and create a configuration. This is one of our demo assemblies provided by ZoomX. It's a tabletop orange juicing machine. Now I could select components, right-click and hide them, or I could uncheck them from the assembly tree, or I could use my customized radial menu to access the toggle display command. I'll click on these 2 covers to toggle their display state to hidden, and then go back to my select command to confirm that's what I want. The other way to hide things, such as all assemblies, would be to select them and then right-click hide. Now the only things visible are most of the juice's cover parts, and I want to access this display state in future, but I don't want to keep having to hide things manually. So let's create a configuration to save this state. Open the config menu and click New, and give it a logical name. This is the second most important assembly configuration I want to access in my day-to-day work, and it shows only part of the assembly cover, so my colleague should understand this name. When all the parts are visible again, I can go back to my list of configs, check the box against my new one, and it's now applied to the assembly, with no need to show or hide things manually. If at any point you want to edit or overwrite an existing config, activate it, hide and show the components as necessary, then click the Save Display Configuration button, highlighted here. And now for something a little bit different. Here's an assembly line workstation, and just like before, I'll apply a single config, the case and conveyor one. Here's a warning about deleted parts, which I'll ignore for now. I'll explain why that's appearing and how to solve it later on in this video. What I want to show you here is what happens when many configs are applied at the same time. If I select configs 1 to 7 from the list, it will show all components which are visible in at least one of these configs. If certain subsystems are saved in configs, this is a nice easy way to show your assembly in a modular fashion. Now I'll show all the components in the assembly with right-click Show All, and the more observant among you will have noticed that I have a zone called Workspace. Bear in mind that zones are only available if you have a certain license type, so you may not be able to create them unless you have this license. I'll go ahead and apply this zone, and as you can see, only certain parts are shown. But instead of using selection to define which parts are shown and hidden, what I have is a cuboid-shaped zone which encompasses all the parts you can see here. If I show all zone boxes with this menu right here, you can see that I have only one zone, and that was used to define which parts would be shown and which would not. Multiple zones and configs can be applied at the same time, and there's no particular difference in their behavior in this list. So now we know how to create and apply configurations, but that's not the only way we can save our assembly view states. Each assembly can also contain one snapshot, or fast configuration that has no name, and can be created by clicking this camera button. If you don't want to save a permanent configuration, click this before hiding or showing components. When you want to return to this display state, click Restore Snapshot, and the parts visible and hidden when you took the snapshot will be shown as visible and hidden again, a bit like a bookmark. If you save the assembly, this also saves the snapshot. However, there can be only one snapshot per assembly. Snapshots are used when a particular display configuration would be convenient, but not worth creating a full configuration from. As of ST9, there is also the Isolate command, as many users tend to use their right-click menu for showing and hiding selected parts. It doesn't interact with configurations, but it's more for the times when you want to show only certain components and then immediately return to the last display state without needing to use snapshot or configurations. You can use it by selecting components in 3D, right-clicking, and then selecting Isolate, and you'll see only the parts you had selected, plus two buttons on the right side of the screen. Clicking the top one of these two, the camera button, will restore the previous view state, and the cross button, right below it, will dismiss it instead. Here's an example of Snapshot and Isolate in action. What you can see here is the internal mechanism of the ZoomX juicer. Now let's hide some of this drivetrain by fence selecting and then right-click hiding. At this point I'm going to take a snapshot and show all the components. If I restore the snapshot though, the same parts show themselves as we had at the start, just after we hid the drivetrain. That's the first alternative to configurations, but bear in mind you can only have one of these per assembly. You might have noticed that the snapshot also appears in the config list. Now to show Isolate, and explain how it's different to configs and snapshots. Let's select the motor and mounting plate, right-click, and whereas in ST8 or before I would only have Show Only, here I have Isolate. If I click it, the result looks like Show Only, but these two buttons appear on the right, Restore Isolate and Dismiss Isolate. Restore will show the last display state. Let's isolate again. And Dismiss simply removes this option, leaving you with just the motor and mounting plate. In this case, I could have skipped back to my snapshot, but had I not taken that snapshot, Restore Isolate would have been my only way to go back to that particular display state, as show and hide operations can't be undone with Ctrl-Z. Now we'll show you how to edit and manage your configs once they've been created. Let's say you've added more components, and you want them to be hidden in several existing configurations at once. You could either edit each config manually with the Save Display Configuration workflow, or you could select the parts you want to hide and use the Copy Current Display button. This opens a list of existing configs, and checking the boxes and clicking OK will save the part's display state to each of these configs. In other words, any hidden parts you had selected will be hidden in each of these configs, and any shown parts will be shown. Just bear in mind that you have to select the new parts before you can start this command. So that's a quick way of adding new parts to your existing configurations, but there is another way to do so. Configuration Manager offers much more detailed control over your configs, providing a parts list style view, and tools designed to check for new and deleted components. The easiest way to use Configuration Manager is to look down the columns for components to hide and show. A checked box in a row for a particular column will show this part or subassembly in a particular config, and an unchecked box will hide it. Some of you may also want to manually create multiple config files for each assembly. Each of these can contain a different list of configs for the same assembly. Some users might want to keep all mechanical configs separate to their electrical ones, for example, or have a set of configs to be used by their manufacturing team. By default, there's only one .cfg file created with each assembly, but if you use the Browse button, you can manually link your assembly to another existing file. Be careful with this, as many applications use the file extension .cfg, so my advice is to keep all config files in the same location as their assembly. The buttons at the top of the Configuration Manager are particularly useful if your assembly is still being edited. For example, New Components display state is undefined in any config after they're added, and the Find New Component buttons will highlight the new components one at a time. This allows you to decide which configurations they should appear in by checking the appropriate boxes. Something else we've already run into in the assembly line model is this warning when you apply configuration after removing parts from an assembly. Your config list doesn't automatically update when you do this, but opening Configuration Manager will allow you to run the Clean Up Deleted Components command, which will rewrite the assembly CFG file and removes from all configs any components that are no longer in the assembly. Back to the demos we go. Here's the assembly that showed the deleted parts warning before. And let's apply the same config as before, and as expected we see the same warning, but this time I won't ignore it. I could save all the configs individually by activating them and pressing save, but that takes too much time. So how do I edit every configuration at once? Well, with Configuration Manager. As you can see, we have all our assembly configs in a nice neat table format, showing what's visible and hidden in each. And this can be as granular as you want it. If you want to dive into a subassembly and hide just one component, you can do that by expanding the table, which shows more checkboxes. If you want to expand all levels, right-click on the top level and check Expand All. And if you want to use the right-click menu on subassemblies or parts, you have the option to show or hide parts in all configs at once, rather than clicking boxes over and over again. Highlighting columns will allow you to drag and reorder the configs. However, to rename them, you'll still have to use the Display Configurations command. The three buttons at the top of this table are particularly useful, so let's go through them from left to right. Find Next New Component expands the tree and highlights the first new part in the list, searching from top to bottom, and waits for the user to make a decision. These two Find buttons, Find Next and Find Previous, allow you to filter only the new parts, rather than having to expand the entire assembly to look for new component checkboxes in this column. To collapse any assembly nodes afterwards, you may wish to double-click them. Alternatively, double-click the top level twice to collapse and expand the entire assembly to one level. These tools can save quite a lot of time if you're editing configs for very large assemblies. Now to fix that pesky configuration warning, I'll use the Clean Up Deleted Components command. And I've clicked it, but nothing appears to have happened. But that's to be expected. I'll just go ahead and prove it worked by saving all the configs at once, and then I'll try to reapply the Case and Conveyor config. First I'll switch to a new one, and then back to Case and Conveyor. And there you have it, no more warnings, and my configs are all up to date. The Configuration Options menu can change Solid Edge's behaviour when your configs are applied, and are there more for ease of use than to actually edit your configs. You may want to change these, depending on your personal preferences. Here are all the available options, but the easiest way to discuss them is to show them in action. I'll also show you a trick regarding subassembly configs that might interest you. Here we are back in the top-level assembly, and as you might expect, we have our configurations in one list. If I select a subassembly, and then open up my configs list, I'll see a completely different list. But you'll notice it's read-only, as I can't choose the New button right here. This is the configuration list for the subassembly that I have selected, and I could apply this to the existing top-level configs if needed. However, it's read-only, and that might be a problem. So let's try editing the subassembly configs. Edit in place should do the trick, right? Well, not really, but I'll explain exactly why while we see for ourselves what happens. If I choose the subassembly and then edit in context, my config list is still the one for the top level. And you might have noticed it still has the new button. That's because we still have the top level assembly open and loaded in this window, and it can only ever access the currently loaded .cfg file, not one for a different assembly. If you hide the previous level with Ctrl-Q, you do get the config list for the subassembly, but because we still have the top level open, as we see in the assembly tree on the side, it's still read-only. To edit a subassembly's configs, you must use the open command, not edit. If we do so, in this window that's opened right here, the active CFG file is the one for the subassembly, and we can change or add to it as much as we like. Here's the new config button again. You might have noticed that this subassembly had a configuration marked die-explode in the list, which is an exploded config created through the ERA environment. This doesn't show up by default, but my config options have been set to show them without the need to go into ERA first. These options are always set on the workstation, not for individual assemblies, so let's take a closer look at them. Here's the menu and all of your available options. Fit View After Apply is the first one on the list, and what this does is it runs the Fit View command after you apply configuration, which then centers the view only on the visible parts. I prefer to keep this on, as it saves time when dealing with large assemblies which have small subassemblies. List Exploded Configurations is the option I already had checked, which then, as the name might suggest, allows you to show all the existing exploded configs while you're still in the normal assembly environment, and define an action to take when they're applied. Either it'll ask the user to switch to the ERA environment, it'll show the explosion as read-only, or it'll switch to the ERA environment and apply the explosion. If you turn the option Use Single Default Configuration on, the default config that SolidEdge opens this assembly with shall be the same for all users, called Default SolidEdge. If the option is off, in the config list you'll see default configurations for each user who's worked on and saved this assembly, which may be useful if all users are looking after different areas of the assembly. Activation settings change how the assembly components are activated when they're shown and hidden via configs. You may wish to activate or inactivate all parts after applying a new config, but I tend to use the Maintain Current State option personally. Simplification settings here act in a similar way to activation settings, but instead of activating and inactivating, applying configs may prioritize either simplified or designed states for the assembly parts and subassemblies. I tend to use Maintain Current State to keep my life simple, but once again, that's just down to personal preference. So let's show this in action. Now that I have Fit View After Apply active, I'll show you what it does. Let's apply a config 3 again. And, as you see, it fits my view only to show the visible parts. The same goes for if I show the hydraulic press. And then back again to all parts. It fits the view each time. The other option I have on is the Exploded Configurations option, and the top level assembly doesn't have any of those, but if I open the hydraulic press subassembly again, I can see the explosion, which, when applied, should open the ERA environment. So let's test that. Let's apply the explosion, and here we are in the ERA environment, where we can edit this explosion if we choose, but instead we'll go back to our All Parts config. Although it looks like I should go into my configuration manager at some point in the future with this subassembly. To summarize, we've explained what configurations are, how to create and apply them, and how they'll differ from your SolidWorks configs. Snapshot and Isolate are also useful commands that allow fast configs to be applied, so users don't need to create hundreds of configurations in one assembly. We've learned that it's also possible to apply multiple configurations at the same time, meaning that showing only the subsystems you need in a large assembly is made easy. Finally, after creation we showed how to manage your configs via Configuration Manager and alter Solid Edge's behaviour when a configuration is applied. Thank you very much for watching, and if you have any further questions, areas of Solid Edge you'd like to see covered in future videos, or other feedback, please either leave a comment below or send them to us by email at support@cuttingedge.co.uk. And just so you guys know, this will be the last episode we produce in Solid Edge ST10. The next one will be in Solid Edge 2019, and we'll kick off the new software's EDGEcast episodes by looking at the different tables and reference text that can be placed in the draft environment. Until then, thank you very much for watching again, and I'll see you in the next episode of EDGEcast.